I hope this conversation is as much fun as the one we had yesterday afternoon, which was great. Claudio wasn't there, but it was a lot of fun. So, the return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón is about ideology. But it's not about ideas. Rather, it is about the passion that ideology, in this case anarchism, can arouse, and the passion with which some people can embrace and live for those ideas. Passion is not a word that Claudio uses, or at least not much, but I use it here because it captures another thing that this book is about: intense personal relationships among those who shared this ideology and sacrificed to see it realized. In fact, the intense personal relationships in this book absolutely cannot be separated from the story of what happened to the ideology and its practitioners. The public and private tragedies recounted here are fully intertwined. He's trying to say.
Sorry, I was just going to suggest there's all these seats. You guys should come sit down rather than stand here. There's all these chairs. Sorry, Margaret.
No problem. The ideology in question is anarchism, or at least it becomes anarchism. The most important element of anarchism for the story is its deep opposition to government. There are a lot of aspects of anarchism that are tough, but that, I think, is the toughest for this group. It's made it hard, especially in the context of the Mexican Revolution, to embrace it fully. Well, maybe it was not hard to embrace, but it was hard to stick with it. Flores Magón did. He did stick with it. But in the process, as this book tells us, he lost almost all of those he loved and who loved him. Since I'm up first, let me do just a little bit of summing up of the story, since probably many of you will not have read the book yet. The public tragedy, and therefore the private tragedies, begins with the oppression of workers under the dictator Porfirio Diaz, especially towards the end of the Diaz dictatorship, so from the late 19th century, the 1890s forward. Outrage at the oppression of workers brings together a small group of dedicated activists and intellectuals at whose core is the title figure, Ricardo Flores Magón, who is hard as nails in his dedication to the Mexican cause, to the cause. Though through writing and organizing, this group becomes dangerous enough to be jailed multiple times in Mexico, and eventually they had to move to the United States, which is a key moment. They continue there to write, publishing the highly influential newspaper Regeneración from the United States, a newspaper that united and energized the formation of hundreds of liberal clubs, as they called themselves, in Mexico in opposition to Diaz. The group's position in the United States was always tenuous. The economic complicity of the United States in the oppression of Mexican workers was matched by a political complicity on the part of the United States with Porfirio Diaz in jailing and helping to control dangerous dissidents on U.S. soil. And members of the group were repeatedly imprisoned in the United States too. But their position of eccentricity, or being outside of Mexico, was not a total liability while Diaz was still in power. In fact, they were seen as pure and devoted enough to the cause to choose exile and to continue their work in the United States. The reputation of the Partido Liberal Mexicano, the PLM, and of Ricardo especially, grew as opposition grew, and Regeneración, the newspaper, was enormously influential in inspiring and providing ideological coherence for the liberal clubs in Mexico that were organizing against Diaz. The position of eccentricity reinforced by the anti-nationalist stance of anarchism, of the ideology, also allowed in the United States for the key collaboration with American socialists and anarchists, men and women, who strengthened the movement in ways that I expect we'll talk more about with Claudio. At least I have some more questions about that. Once the revolution broke out, the key decision was whether the group, and Ricardo in particular, should return to Mexico to participate in the armed revolution that they'd been calling for. Ricardo's difficult position was that he and his newspaper were needed more as intellectual guides than on the battlefield, and he stayed in the United States. This allowed a broader-based movement with a less demanding and less radical ideology led by Francisco Madero to take the lead in the revolution in Mexico. As Madero succeeded, defections from Flores Magón's core group began, and with them terrible recriminations against those who defected from those who remained. The defectors were accused of being traitors, among other things. There was great bitterness, brothers and families and old friends torn apart. The political became personal. Ricardo stood firm and pure even as the group's role in the revolution shrank and as his family and friends dropped off or were driven off. The newspaper could hardly be published. It was in grave financial difficulty for years, and it eventually became mainly irrelevant within Mexico, at least as measured by the number of issues that were produced and the number and the location of the subscribers. It was much more predominantly subscribed in the United States. It was no consolation that some elements of their program were incorporated into the 1917 Constitution. Of the triad of anarchist enemies, capital, authority, and the church, there was some anti-capital and quite a bit of anti-church elements in the Constitution. But because the key elements of direct action and elimination of government were nowhere to be found, this was in no way a consolation. When Ricardo died in Leavenworth prison, he'd been in prison in the United States more than he was not. He had an enormous and enviable reputation as the purest of the revolutionaries, but by this time he had almost no power. He had never returned to Mexico until he returned as a corpse under conditions that would have dismayed him greatly. True, his body was accompanied by thousands of workers, and in some cities that the funeral train passed through there were pro-worker rallies, but in Mexico City there were none, and the most clever state builder of all the revolutionaries, Álvaro Obregón, sent a magnificent wreath. His widow and his brother Enrique had quarreled over his body, and many of his old comrades were ensconced in positions of power in the government. A tragic end to both the public story and the private story. Historiographically, this book accomplishes a lot. It rescues Flores Magón, Ricardo, from the position of marginality he occupies in most of the historiography on the revolution. Even as the book is centrally concerned with understanding and explaining why that marginality existed. By rescuing Flores Magón, it also rescues ideology as important in the Mexican Revolution and as important in studying the Mexican Revolution. Ideology, Claudio writes in one of the many beautiful sentences in this book, was a constantly invoked absence, too pure for ordinary mortals to embody. It was also the revolution's most cherished transcendental object. It fits alongside the classic treatments of other revolutionary leaders, Zapata by John Womack, and published in 1968, if I'm right, and Pancho Villa, whose Life and Times was written by Friedrich Katz 30 years later in 1998, although it was written over a long period of time. Both of whom, unlike many historians of the revolution who these days are particularly interested in political culture or in class struggle, went out of their way to seek a measure of ideological coherence for their heroes, which is one of the reasons why I think this book fits alongside those two in particular. Womack found an ideology for Zapata. Katz looked hard and sort of did for Villa. In both cases, their ideologies are depicted as growing out of their experiences before and during the revolution. And in some ways, I think because the Flores Magón and his group were not in Mexico, this interpretation of ideologies growing out of experience doesn't feel immediately as available to people as the Zapata and Villa experiences do. But I think one of the central arguments of this book is that the PLM's ideology did grow out of its conditions of imprisonment in Mexico and especially of exile in the United States. And in its relationships to the American socialists and anarchists that were only possible it was only possible for them to be part of this group with the group being in the United States. I should stop there. I can save this last point I wanted to make for a question later.
Okay. I think this works. So here's my take at the heart of the book. We told each other that we would sum it all up in a sentence. So my first sentence says it all. The return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón is a revolutionary tragedy that plays out across three different dimensions. First, there is the personal tragedy experienced by Ricardo himself as a revolutionary. We meet him as a young person of intelligence and learning, living in a corrupt and manicured system. Paths to advancement are blocked not only for him, but for his contemporaries. And the inequity and the hopelessness of the Diaz regime becomes crystallized for Ricardo and for many of his contemporaries following the suppressed protests that came in the wake of the 1892 election. Ricardo comes to believe that only genuinely radical change can bring justice and well-being to Mexico. And the commitments that he comes into as a result of these realizations, anarchism, which for him meant opposition to private property, to the state, and to the church. While he had to mask or at least blunt the sort of radical implications of these commitments early on, he and his brothers do manage to establish the newspaper Regeneración in 1900, and they earn national reputations through bold critiques of the state. The radicalism of Ricardo's vision forces him to flee Mexico, but the personal tragedy is not so much in the flight, it is in how that vision makes it impossible for him to ever return to Mexico as anything but a corpse. He can't go back before the revolution begins in 1910 because the state won't allow it. He can't go back before 1910 and after 1910 much of the time because he's in prison a lot. But more fundamentally, he can't go back as a fighter for precisely the reasons that Margaret said and that Claudio so articulately explains in the book, and that is his conviction that he is simply worth more to the revolution writing, even in exile, than he is to go down there kind of as a hapless guy carrying a rifle. And finally, and in some ways most interestingly, he can't go back because part of his political vision is the conviction that the cult of personality that he believes infects almost all political movements like a cancer is something that he would inevitably succumb to or be dragooned into were he to return formally to the fight in Mexico. As to say, he would be elevated as a person. He would become a new caudillo. And this is something that he refuses to let happen and therefore won't go back or can't go back. So the first of the three tragedies that I see that's sort of structured the book for me is that Ricardo's commitments to Mexico inevitably sever him from Mexico, and that separation is permanent. Second, there is the tragedy of the revolutionary community. The heart of the book, it seems to me, is in its loving but honest portrait, kind of unflinching portrait, of a community of idealistic and brave young Mexicans and Americans who, for a time, devote their lives to each other and to this vague thing, the Mexican cause, vague for the folks from the United States. The book patiently explains how these connections emerged and where the commitments come from. And we learned that Americans like Ethel Duffy and John Turner, John Murray, and Elizabeth Trowbridge really knew almost nothing at all about Mexico. These people kind of emerge as warriors in search of a cause, effectively. People that were convinced that there was something rotten in modern life and in the state and in something superficial and deeply unsatisfying about mainstream life. And when they encounter or hear about and then encounter the imprisoned Magón brothers in Los Angeles, they find their cause. They find something that's worth fighting for, and they believe that they can help, and so they decide that they will, or they'll try to. And in the course of the book, we see the relationship blossom, and we see the intimacies, we see the chemistry, the synergy that happens because these remarkable people come together in the way that they do and what they're able to produce as a consequence. And then in one of the most engrossing parts of the book, we're taken along on the breathless journey of the group's greatest triumph, which is the exposure of slavery in parts of Mexico, and something that Turner, in his book, it comes out first in articles and then in the book Barbarous Mexico, Turner dubs the Diaz system, right? That it's not just an unpleasant feature of modern Mexico, it's at the heart of this thing that's rotten in the country. And we're guided through the inexorable tragedy, and we're returning to this tragedy, of the community's own destruction. Really, it's self-destruction, inevitable self-destruction. Beset by Mexican and by U.S. spies and by would-be infiltrators, members of the group, Ricardo in particular, necessarily become hyper-vigilant and suspicious, not only of strangers and of people who come into contact with the group, but ultimately of the group itself. At the same time, once Diaz falls, as Margaret said, everyone's cards have to be on the table. Ricardo and his community can no longer be vague about what they would like to see happen once Diaz is gone. Before then, it's all about getting Diaz gone. They have commitments and they make some of them plain, but once Diaz is gone, they can't hide this anymore. And I think the rupture with Madero and this very practical kind of moderate program was inevitable. And it does immense damage to the community itself. The suspicions and the alarm over ideological purity fuel what Claudio terms the Judas cycle, wherein Ricardo in particular, again, feels moved to denounce potential allies like Madero, come out explicitly against them. And again, not simply say, I disagree and I can't support this, but demonize the people with whom he disagrees in the most powerful and often even obscene, deeply upsetting ways. And this is turned not only against people like Madero, but people who had been close comrades and intimate friends and even family. And it's really striking, and I think it's one of the most difficult things to read in the book. The unblinking, unflinching expose of the depth of the poison that Ricardo in particular was able to mobilize against people with whom he disagreed. So I know we'll talk more about that. I hope we will. It was one of the most disturbing and important parts of the book, I think. Now, many of the members of the group who were spared these direct attacks, they pull away from it either in disillusionment or disgust because of the attacks. So it's really coming apart from the inside. So the second tragedy here is that the personal and the political commitments to a radical idea that were themselves crucial to nurturing this remarkable community, this remarkable transnational community, also tear it apart from the inside. Third and finally, there is the tragedy of the revolutionary idea itself. Put simply, Ricardo and many of his comrades surrender their comforts, their friendships, their revolutionary community, their families, even their lives, for a radical idea that was uncompromising and beautiful in many ways, and was also based on historical illusions that had very little practical support anywhere in Mexico. The movement itself basically collapses 6 months into the Mexican Revolution. Partly this was due to the suspicions and to the Judas cycle, but Claudio explains that Ricardo's theory of revolution was built on an illusion. The illusion was that Porfirio Diaz was an absolute sovereign, that the things that were so wretched in Mexico came not really because of people's willingness to accept them or because they believed that this was sort of the least bad system available, but because Diaz was such an ultimate sovereign. And he has this wonderful line, there's many of them in the book, but this one especially really stayed with me. Ricardo and his colleagues were possessed of the illusion that not a leaf in Mexico's political forest shook without Diaz's approval. This fiction was useful, of course, in pre-revolutionary rhetoric, but once the revolution broke out, it left Magón and his faction totally unequipped to exert practical power or meaningfully shape events on the ground. And this is one of the reasons that I find so persuasive the argument for why he didn't go and get a rifle and go to Mexico. I think that even if he did, it wouldn't have changed anything. I mean, it just seems to me that he just was in no position to make a meaningful contribution, other than potentially martyrdom, was in no position to make a meaningful contribution on the ground. The practical incoherence of the revolutionary ideal that Ricardo and his companions sacrificed so much for, then, is the final tragedy of the book, as I see it. What do you think?
I've been dreading having to define what the book is about ever since I started writing it. But first, thank you so much for being here, for doing this, and for having read the book. I have to say, I think that reading it is probably harder than having written it, is what it is. So truly, it means a lot to me. So
not true, you guys.
And it's true that there's a lot of Berkeley in this book, and the Bancroft Library in particular, which supported me through this. Teresa Salazar and Tom. Sorry, and so I'm giving a round of thanks to the organizers, to Tom LeCoeur as well, for having instigated this. So yesterday, Margaret and Brian said that I should say what the book is about, and I really had been dreading it. First thing I'd say about it, what kind of a book is it? I think, having written it, because it took me, I decided what it's about after writing it to some extent. The first thing I'd say about it is that it's about its form. I think that it's something like a novel / history / essay. And I see it as kind of my contribution to the genre that Truman Capote called the nonfiction novel. It does have, I think, the structure of a tragedy. I think that's correct, even though it has a lot of, and rather than an epic, but it does start with the Odyssey, and the images of Odysseus and of the Odyssey are very important in the book. So the question of return is fundamental, except that return is, in fact, return a la Odysseus is in fact an impossibility, both for Ricardo, for his brother Enrique, both of whom do return. Ricardo dead, and as a hero, Enrique to do the revolution, and then becomes absorbed into the Mexican political system, and therefore kind of demonized by his erstwhile friends. So either way, if you come back dead, the only good revolutionary is a dead revolutionary in this case. And coming back and alive was basically to be marginalized into relevance, murdered, or absorbed. In that sense, I agree also with what Brian said. So what is it about? I think that it is about exile and transnationalism and their role in kind of personal and collective investments in universalist social movement, and as well as in the construction of a reconstruction of national ideas. That's what it's about. To a large extent, it is about this problem of expatriation of ideology and the presence, or what I use in that kind of post-structuralist way, the presence of the absence of ideology in the Mexican Revolution as an effect of exile. That is, one of the things that gave rise to this book for me was a paper that I wrote once that I never published, which was about the ideological incoherence of the Mexican Revolution. I tried to explain why the two most important revolutionary movements, that the one led by Carranza and the one led by Villa, the most important in the sense of the ones that had a real shot at controlling the national state, both were characterized by ideological incoherence. In the case of Carranza, who was a liberal, he was a liberal who was for private property against communal property, and he nonetheless passed an agrarian law and promoted an agrarian law within the constitution that he let's say, shepherded. And in the case of Villa, who was an agrarista and therefore for agrarian reform, he doesn't actually distribute land, although he expropriates land and estates, because if he were to distribute land, his soldiers would have stayed in the land that was distributed, so he couldn't actually fight nationally and distribute land. So you have this quality of ideological incoherence that has often been remarked around the Mexican Revolution, remarked as prominence of caudillismo, that is prominence of, or what at that time was called in Mexico personalismo. And that is the notion that you don't really have ideologies, you have followers of leaders like Carranza, Villa, Zapata, etc. The only leader that is sometimes credited with ideological purity, who is Zapata, is also recognized as not having had the ability to really move outside of his region of influence for the same, because he did what Villa did not do, which is to distribute land. So distributing land kind of anchored him and made him a regional leader of national significance, especially after his martyrdom. That was this paper that I've been writing about, in a nutshell, about ideological incoherence, and then later I started realizing, well, there's a, like in that old Woody Allen movie, there's something missing, but what was missing was this problem of exile, and as a constant source of ideological production, and of really quite elaborate ideological production, including ideas about revolution long before the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Liberal Party, the Magonistas, as some people call them, they didn't like that name themselves, exactly because it was a personalist name rather than an ideological recognition of a movement. They tried to raise a revolution in 1906 and again in 1908. They had a revolutionary program in 1906. So the idea that the Mexican Revolution didn't actually have an ideology is actually historically false. You have it, preceding the outbreak of the revolution in 1910 for a number of years, but it's relying constantly on the space that's existing in the United States, a space that's been forged through migration, the new transnationalism that occurred thanks to the linkage of Mexico and the U.S. by rail and importation of American capital into Mexico. All of that added to the phenomenon of exile in the United States, so that these exiles actually had local communities. They weren't just individual exiles floating around. They could actually be militants in the United States with substantial, not only economic support for their movements, but also people that they could raise. So that was really the piece that I realized was missing, and that's how the idea for this book began. What I'd say are, what I think are some of the contributions is in part this problem of passion that Margaret talks about. I see one of the things that I feel I discovered in the process of researching the book was something a little bit akin to kind of Max Weber's arguments around asceticism, Protestantism, the spirit of capitalism. Here we have an asceticism that emerges amongst these exiled revolutionaries in the United States. And that asceticism really contrasts with the revolutionary culture that emerges in Mexico after 1910. For example, in issues like love and personal relations. If you look at love, sex in the Mexican Revolution, especially leaders in the Mexican Revolution, but not only the image that's all over the place, is certainly not of romantic love. That is, the image that you have predominantly is of so-called la bola, which is kind of like the image of something like tumbleweed. The revolutionary movement is like an avalanche that sweeps people up, and the people being swept up are sometimes men and sometimes women who are kidnapped and taken away to the revolutionary movement, or who run off to the revolutionary movement, then are abandoned. Any of the major revolutionary leaders in Mexico had multiple women, multiple wives. Villa had 4 recognized wives, and then many more unrecognized ones. Zapata was at 20 or 30 wives in different villages. That was common, and when you look at this movement here, you get instead romantic love. You get intense dyads, and sometimes it's friendship, intense friendship, whether or not it's homosexual friendship or not is something that I choose not to try to pronounce myself on, although sometimes Ricardo did use accusations of homosexuality as a weapon against the people who he felt were betraying the movement internally. So you get this whole issue of kind of homosexual panic that exists in the theme of betrayal. But that's a theme like love, the intensity of betrayal, the intensity of work ethic among the people in the movement. These people do resemble a little bit a sort of Ben Franklin kind of sort of thrifty workers who are working by day and revolutionists by night. They're not like the image of the Mexican Revolution that you have in, and it's not just an image, you have it in the writing all over the place in Mexico, like the revolutionary as sort of Dionysian figure who is taking things in front of him or her and just sort of sweeping with the movement. Here you have workers, a work ethic, friendship, love, and a betrayal, and that's the kind of anthropology of that is one of the main concerns of the book, because I think that it shows that you do have the production of different kinds of revolutionary cultures depending on this issue, in part of exile. The other thing is this business of personalismo, that has to do with what Margaret was saying, that is the issue of ideology. What I show in the book is that the concern with personalismo, that is a concern with trying to define yourself against political constructs that were based on following the leader, is something that existed in Mexico at the origin of this movement, way long before it turned toward anarchism. What it used to try to construct itself was a return to what they call Jacobin liberalism, that is the liberalism of the generation prior to Porfirio Diaz coming into office, Juarez, Lerdo, etc. And they tried to construct themselves as pure liberals, and they used Diaz's compromises with the old conservatives, including with the church, in order to present themselves as pure ideologues. So the kind of rabid anti-clericalism, in part, has an early origin that is prior to the anarchism. And you see that then in the Mexican Revolution itself, where there are factions that subscribe to that kind of anti-clericalism, who by no means see themselves as anarchists and have really nothing in particular to do with anarchism. So you have that old tradition of anti-personalismo that takes on such prestige in the group that it becomes a bit of a problem, I think, in terms of this construction of the self for people like Ricardo Flores Magón, especially in exile. The reason for that, I think, is that once these young men and a couple of women to come to the United States as exiles, they have to take up constantly, they have to take up collections. They have to take up collections in order to put out their newspaper. They have to take up collections in order to do a revolution. They have to take up collections in order not to work, in order to be able to do all that. And because they're asking for money, they have to then portray themselves as they're open, constantly open, to accusations of embezzlement. And they're in fact constantly being accused of embezzlement. This is a lifelong thing for them. So the only way to defend yourself against a charge of embezzlement is to live incredibly modestly, incredibly poorly. So they become sort of something like Franciscans of sort or something like that. That is, they become absolute renouncers, despite the fact that the ideology in anarchism is very much, in many ways, a very worldly ideology that is for love and for all kinds of things like that. And so you have that combination of asceticism with the kind of agape of the anarchist ideology that is kind of strange and interesting. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah. So many things to follow up on. Since you agreed with my use of the word tragedy and Brian's use of the word tragedy, can we ask you about the extent to which Flores Magón is at the center of the book, even though in your prologue you say that you need another guide through this material, that Flores Magón burned out, that he, and yet, you know, I think it is about him in the end. What's your position on on him as a sort of character in this tragedy? Is it the hubris of his fall? Is that the right word to use? I mean, how is he a character in the tragedy? Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Well, first I'd say about the tragedy that I think it's a tragedy not necessarily in the sense that the ending is tragic for a number of the figures, which it is for many of them, not for all of them, but it's a tragedy in the sense that the actors are surpassed by the events that they help to create. That's what I mean by it's a tragedy, and that they don't recognize very well when the revolution arrives. There's a kind of like something like méconnaissance. There's a kind of difficulty in recognizing what it is in comparison to what they had imagined. They certainly have no difficulty recognizing that it's a revolution. That's not the issue, but they do have trouble with what it is. And that's also, I think, symptomatic of the tragedy in that sense. That is, that the actors these are very, very committed, as both of you said, very committed people, deeply committed people who are very active all the time. And they're really, to some extent, for my taste, kind of hyperkinetic. I mean, the level of activity is exhausting. I mean, even just reading about it. And so they're so actively involved in shaping these events, and at the same time, the events are in some way kind of unrecognizable, and they do them in. That's what I mean by that. It's a tragedy in structure, that the book tells that. Now, the role of Ricardo in this is to do with the idea that I had was to write a kind of collective biography and a collectivist biography. It's a biography about cooperation, and especially about American and Mexican cooperation, which I think this movement is to some extent the first radical transnational movement between Mexico and the United States, and one of the first transnational movements between Mexico and the United States, period. So I was interested in cooperation. In fact, initially my idea was to write a book that just followed a couple of friendships. So the book is divided into 5 parts, and the second part was initially my idea what the book was going to be, and it wasn't, Ricardo wasn't in it. It was about John Turner and Lázaro Gutiérrez de Lara, who was the guy who led Turner into Mexico. And then I started looking at friendships, and just started getting out of hand, and that's what happened. But in the book, I mean, is what happened. But the reason why Ricardo, I think you're right that the book has Ricardo absolutely in the center, so much that in the end the title has Ricardo in it. But the reason, I think, is because Ricardo is in that position at the same time being the center of the ideology, because he's the editor of the paper, because he's the one who's always insistent on keeping this paper alive. So in some way, the history of the paper is the key to this whole thing. I mean, I quote in there in the book a line from Martin Guzman, the famous Mexican novelist who'd been with Villa in his biography, the portion that he was with Villa. He describes Villa. He says Villa was his gun, and he has this incredible description of Villa, where you see him practically as a gun, and the gun is an extension of Villa, and I think that you could say of Ricardo that he was his newspaper. There is no Ricardo without the newspaper. The newspaper is everything in this story, and so it's a biography of Ricardo to the extent that Ricardo's in this position of the extremity of ideology on the one hand and self-sacrifice on the other, represented in part in his death and in the mobilization of his body, which kind of guarantees in the end his ensconcement in the pantheon, which is an issue. Some of the historians of the revolution, like for example Alan Knight, who's a major historian of the Mexican Revolution, claimed in his sort of 2-volume, heavy authoritative history that this movement actually wasn't a precursor of the Mexican Revolution, that it existed and then it didn't actually influence as much as people in Mexico have claimed. And I think he's wrong about that, but he's not entirely wrong. That is the question about the problem of the mystery of how it is that a movement that became so militarily so irrelevant so soon was still adopted at a certain point as kind of being at the root of the Mexican Revolution. And Knight doesn't analyze that because he's a social historian who doesn't look at these kinds of things.
I think this sort of follows up on that. All the liberal clubs in Mexico that continue to, I mean, we continue to see them, and you'd think that they would have disappeared into the, I mean, we see the people in the core group dropping off, and yet every now and then they're still there. What do you think those people were? I mean, when you were talking about anti-clericalism, it occurred to me that maybe that's a very sort of visceral thing that they could latch onto in this ideology that was. But what do you think? Why did those clubs? Was it the newspaper? Was it this purity of Magón? Was it something else like an association of the PLM with hatred of priests, and as simple as that?
I'm not sure how to answer it because I think there's still work to do on that particular topic. I don't think this book resolves that question so well. But my impression is that there are some aspects of the analysis that Regeneración is producing of the revolution, in particular the break with Madero, that is actually kind of right. I mean, despite the fact that there's so much about the Ricardo thing that is a problem and that often gets things wrong, there's some of the analysis that he has of Maderismo is totally right. I mean, the break with Madero is a kind of political disaster. I mean, he breaks with Madero while Porfirio Díaz is still in office. So therefore, he seems to many as basically supporting Díaz against Madero. I mean, the politics of the break are a disaster. I mean, no. But the idea that he had was that in the end, people like Madero and others were what you call personalists. That is, they were in it for their own political motives, and they weren't sufficiently committed to kind of an economic revolution, and so they were going to fall. because in fact the movement that was behind all this was not only interested in democratic reform, but was interested in other kinds of things. And that was really his bet. And he was very consistent and explicit in that bet, and that bet was right. I mean, that was true. The calls to direct action, to taking the land, to taking the factory, and all these kinds of things in the process of the revolution were influential, and some of the people who went into that weren't at all anti-clerical. I mean, Zapata, who was influenced by these ideas very much, and some of his key ideologues came from this group, was not anti-clerical.
So I want to ask a question, and then I think we'll just throw it open to the room. And I want to ask about nationalism. And in the introduction, you say that part of your affection for this group of people as subjects and why you wanted to write about them had to do with a sense of the way that they tried to move beyond nationalism towards something more cooperative. And that is, a strong message about the transnational character of the cohort that is the focus of the book. So I guess I have two questions. One is about Ricardo in particular, because I couldn't quite see it in him. He always seemed to me to be, he was there, he was in the United States, and he was happy to partner with people from the United States who were willing to give him money or help him and that were like-minded, and to draw on their support when he needed them, even distant people, Mother Jones and whoever. But he didn't seem to me to be someone who changed his mind about anything really critical as a consequence of these relationships. And he also seemed to me to be a profound, instinctual, reflexive nationalist. And that's not in the sense of glorifying a state, obviously, but that he just seemed basically disinterested in the United States, vaguely contemptuous of most everything in the United States, and so totally focused on Mexico. So I guess my first question then is, did he really transcend nationalism? And then secondly, when you say that we can find something valuable in this story for our present sort of predicament, what do you think it is?
What did you say that he was vaguely contemptuous of the United States? He wasn't always so vague. When they arrived, when this group arrived, there were two groups that arrived almost simultaneously in 1904 to Texas first. When they arrive, they start trying to create a party that actually has a role, that is a membership, fees. That is, they tried to create something that looks like a modern political party, which it had not been in Mexico. It had been a collection of local political clubs. And they tried to they create a program for the party, and they call for collection for the paper and also to raise a revolution. In their calls for that kind of support, they present their exile very much as the ultimate self-sacrifice. That is, from the beginning, the exile is presented and cast in nationalist terms. In that sense, you're absolutely right. They saw themselves, first of all, as patriots, and the whole liberal movement in Mexico before the arrival to the United States was a deeply Republican movement. That is, it was about the Republic, and it was a sort of French, it's a revolutionary Jacobin movement that saw in the end the people as the Mexican people. So it's definitely true that nationalism is there from the start, and I think it's always there. That is, there's a place, a special place for Mexico. But I also believe that there's a real transformation, and that transformation does get some of these people in trouble. The transformation occurs first socially, that is, socially in terms of relations of solidarity, in some cases marriages, love relations, things like that, which are told in the book in some cases. But it also it extends to the problem of education. The solidarity is not only about giving money, but it's also about the actual political education that the migrants in the United States, not just the elite of the party, the Junta Organizadora, which is just a group of men, but rather the broader group was really to some extent socialized in unions and the like in the United States, which included a lot of Italians, a lot of Spaniards, a lot of Russians, Jewish immigrants and the like. So there's a kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of proletarian cosmopolitanism that occurs in the United States that has actually not at all been digested in Mexico. It's one of the things that I think is interesting about this story, is going to be interesting about the story when the book comes out in Spanish, because the problem of cosmopolitanism in Mexico has been discussed mostly for the elites, and the kind of proletarian cosmopolitanism which you have here, I mean, deeply. I mean, these are meetings that are happening in German and Yiddish in Ricardo has two funerals, one in Los Angeles and then one in Mexico. And the one that happens in Los Angeles, they in the end sing the Marseillaise, which is what, you know, the battling of all of the anarchists, and they sing the Marseillaise in Italian, Spanish, Italian, English, Yiddish, and German. So there is a kind of cosmopolitanism that's happening there. You can see it briefly in Regeneración itself has an Italian language page because they have the support from Italian union people from California. So there is a kind of cosmopolitanism that's actually a part of the education of the entire group, despite the fact that you have the nationalism as well. And that's eventually also works out pragmatically in a complicated way, which is the episode that we haven't talked about, the episode of the Baja California episode. Mm-hmm. That is, at a certain point, very early on in the revolution, this group has basically lost foothold to a large extent in Chihuahua, which is the key zone of the Mexican Revolution, and Sonora. And so they try to gain a foothold in Baja California. They take Tijuana and Mexicali, the northern part of Baja California, and that campaign includes a lot of Americans, that is mostly Wobblies and the like, and foreigners, not just Americans. You have, you know, people from the Boer War and, you know, weird characters of all kinds of things. It really was a motley crew, if ever there was one, this Baja California thing. So the Baja California thing becomes an issue because they're seen as essentially sort of promoting an American invasion of Baja California, and Ricardo doesn't really defend himself against those charges quickly enough. He's not, so there are aspects of the Mexican nationalism thing that they kind of a little bit lose touch of because of their emphasis on class warfare.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'd ask you to please identify yourself before you ask a question. Now.
Okay, my name is Candace Falk, and I'm the editor of the Golden Papers. So I love that you're working on Magón, and I think there's not enough anarchist history done. And I had some other comments that I feel were kind of left out about the Regeneración, which, by the way, we have a full run of it in the Golden Papers if you need to use it. Very often, just like Emma Goldman, a magazine is used as an organizing tool, like her Mother Earth. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that it was mentioned that some of the donations to the magazine, some of the people who were connected to it, were giving money to run guns to Mexico.
Yeah.
And that a lot of the issues about the U.S. and Mexico had to do with the interest of the U.S. interest in copper in Mexico, and therefore they had a real interest in squelching the Magón brothers. And I think the other thing is that internationalism for anarchists is very different in the sense of, like you're talking about transnationalism. But it's not something that just happened because of the Mexican Revolution, that everybody kept track of each other's movements and who was in danger and who wasn't. And, you know, and people in this country, including like Frank Walsh, who worked in the Wilson administration, gave money for guns to Mexico, so it was there. So I don't want to take up the time, but I want to say also that Emma, I read you some letters from Emma talking about how she helped to get the Magones out of jail in Los Angeles because nobody else could do it. And also what a wonderful party they had afterwards. And also, you know, it's interesting to hear your perspective because I've always been annoyed with her for saying that the Mexican revolutionaries were so primitive and that the peasants were so primitive, and that's what's so beautiful about it. And she compared the Mexican Revolution to the Commune, to the Paris Commune, and thought that it was like the high point of her life at that point. So I just want to say that anarchist ideology is often at the root of a revolution, and then it changes. So I think that in terms of bringing people in, that vision is very seductive. And in terms of thinking that it's a disaster, in terms of like, well, it didn't turn out the way they wanted to, I mean, I think it's a little bit different with Magos because they have a specific goal in mind, but I think that most anarchists, including them, have a vision that goes beyond their lives, and it's not really an aestheticism. There's a very rich community of all different people, and it's and part of it's, as historians, part of what's interesting about it is that anarchists are interested in history. And so they're constantly going back to their own history. And so in terms of the Mexican Revolution, people were learning about it quite a bit after I can go into it. But I want to thank you for, there's not enough history written about this, so it sounds, you know, you have this attitude that, oh, well, they're ridiculous, or they were hoping for something that was impossible. And actually, I mean, some people have that. And in fact, a very profound movement and lots to say about it, and I appreciate that you're doing it.
Thank you. Just very quickly, well, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, they were friends with Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman and many of the other major anarchists here in the U.S., and they did receive all that solidarity, including Emma Goldman's bailing them out of jail once in Los Angeles, and supported every time they were in prison. So those relationships were very, very strong, and they're from quite early on, actually. The copper and all that story, the guns and the newspaper, all of that is in the book. The copper mines in particular are significant because it's an instance of where some of the same companies are operating on both sides of the border, and workers are also operating on the same side, on both sides of the border. Both Mexican workers and American workers are operating on both sides of the border. So it's one of the spaces where you really get, for a while there especially, a new transnationalism, and it's also a place where the dramatization of Porfirio Diaz as an enslaver of Mexicans happens, because the same labor discrimination of Mexicans existed on both sides of the border. So the sense there was then that the Mexican government and the Mexican dictator wasn't in fact defending his race, as they put it, with regard to foreigners. So this gets to Brian's question about nationalism, that is, the racial politics in labor, for example, in copper, but not only in copper, like in railroads and a number of other industries, but that's one that's very important for this particular group, is part of what also creates a tension around the revolution, also as a form of national liberation, but national liberation figured as a form of liberation against slavery. And this is one of the reasons why the anarchism is so important, because there's a very strong reading about enslavement and lack of freedom. I don't say in the book at all, I'm not passing judgment on whether the revolution was successful or not. That's a different kind of question. All I'm saying is that the qualities of the revolution were difficult for the actors themselves to recognize. Not that the revolution didn't bring a lot of good things. The Mexican Revolution, with all of its horrors, and it had a huge amount of horrors, destroyed the federal army, which gave Mexico a better situation than other Latin American countries throughout the 20th century, and distributed land, and all of that occurred to a large extent thanks to ideas that were first forged by the people in this group. So, I don't think it's simple to say that they had no effect, or that they were simply that their work was without consequence.
Sir.
My name is Lachlan. You mentioned that they tried to bring the revolution to Baja California, and you said there was an element of labor element from the United States, and you mentioned also in the newspaper that an Italian page and so on and so forth. And I was wondering a couple things. First of all, was Magón bilingual, or was he just Spanish speaking?
He was, according to Iberian Rivera, who was his closest friend when he died, he spoke English, Spanish, and a little bit of Malagasy. But I think that he, with the possible exception of French, he learned English, which he may have known some in Mexico. He learned all his languages here, and his English, his written English, by the time he's writing from prison in Kansas, is actually excellent. Some of his best writing, I mean, there's mistakes, but it's very eloquent. There's kind of small grammatical mistakes, but it's actually excellent writing. But he's meant not to have been, and he saw himself as not speaking English well enough to speak publicly in English. His brother Enrique did make speeches in English.
But you also mentioned they went to Texas in 1904, you said, and began organizing, and then you said in 06 and 08 they tried to foment revolutions on. Well, what I was wondering is, I remember a diagram I saw a long time ago. It was a diagram of a Texas town. I suspect it was San Antonio or Austin or something like that. It was not Houston. And the Texas town was divided into three parts. There was a white part, and then there were two ghettos, a Mexican ghetto and a black ghetto.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think the same thing existed in San Diego and Los Angeles. I don't think there were any blacks in those two cities. But in Southern California was also a strict Mexican ghetto, and was he more or less operating only within the limits of that ghetto, or was he actually conversing with Emma Goldman and Berkman and various other people in various languages and so on? Was it really transnational, or was it just a ghettoized kind of a movement?
Well, the Mexicans, the bulk of the Mexican population in the United States at that time was in Texas. Texas was by far the biggest Mexican community, and it was very segregated in Texas, but also other places where they went up and down the rail lines, like in Oklahoma or St. Louis, where they were for a while. In Missouri, they had pretty good relations of solidarity with Americans, as you can see when they fall, when they're taken prisoners. There's a lot of articles in the American press, in support, local St. Louis press in support, just like you have that even in places like Arizona, which also had a sharp racialized divide with the Mexicans. You have a lot of quote Anglos or whatever you want to call them supporting this group in places like Douglas and Tucson, like California even more so. So I think you have both. That is, it's a highly segregated population. There's a lot of organizing and propaganda work, as they called it, which is happening within the Mexican community or in public spaces that were of the Mexican community, like in LA. There's like a free speech square, the so-called Placita de los Mexicanos, which was mostly Mexican and some, other Spanish speakers, but mostly Mexicans who were there, and they tended to be there, every time, all the weekend, and the like. So there's more intense participation in the Mexican community, but a lot of movement across, and some of that is happening residentially, some of that is happening in the workplace, and then some of that is happening in the militancy. But there's a lot of this cosmopolitanism in the workplace.
But they were the American socialists and anarchists who were part of this group. They were talking to each other.
Oh yes.
I mean, it was, yeah.
And they were talking to them. That's right.
And fell in love with each other and supported each other in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah, Tom Licker of History. I want to ask a meta-historical question that was actually part of both of your comments and your remarks as well. and that is the formal, the literary form you take revolution to be, and the literary form you take your book to be, say the nonfiction novel. So all of you were interested in the question of tragedy, not just the tragic end, which was tragic, but as a genre, and all of you spoke of passion and how love, in some sense, generates it. So I wonder whether you could speak a little more generally about whether any revolution, anything you could have written about revolution would begin in some sense as epic and end as tragedy. I mean, if you think of the Büchner play Danton's Death, which begins as this great epic and this flood and sweeping everything away and ends in the death of Danton. So there's a way in which all of you sort of captured something about almost the way one has to write this narrative. But I don't know whether you early on figured out that this is the form the narrative had to take, or maybe you could also comment on it as well. I mean, it speaks actually to Margaret's point, what kind of how you figure the narrative. So what I guess I'd like you to speak about a little more is how you came to the form of the nonfiction novel that you wrote.
I don't know how it happened, but
we just talk about it.
I can lie a little bit. One of the things that it had, this has formed. Well, first the first part of your comment or question is true. That is that people who write about revolution constantly, anyone writing about revolution, realizes that revolution is kind of constantly sort of swallowing its children and eating its children, devouring people, in the process consuming people, and in fact, even in popular culture around revolution, the theme of being consumed by the revolution is very prominent, certainly in the Mexican case, but I think in general. There's a good book by Daniel Nugent, who was an anthropologist who died young, called Spent Cartridges of the Revolution, about this town in Chihuahua, and that phrase, spent cartridges of the revolution, isn't his. It was, some of the people he was taking oral histories from. So the notion then that you're kind of left by the wayside, emptied, that in this process is actually very, very common, and you see it all over the place. So yeah, maybe you're right that the revolutionary process itself lends itself to tragedy simply because of the internal structuration of that kind of event, where the beginning and the middle and the end of the story involve a process of destruction that, if you're interested in personhood, which I am very much in this book, necessarily has to lead to tragedy. If you're not interested in that, then no, but you can tell it as, the grand history of the march forward of the revolution, or progress, a progressive history. But if you're interested in characters, people, individuals, and the like, it's hard not to take tragedy seriously as a form, in particular because revolution combines willful activity with absolute relinquishing of any kind of personal power or what's happening even for the leaders, and you can see that. So that's interesting what you're saying there, and maybe what I'd say is that the book is very centrally about a set of characters, maybe a lot of characters actually, that come in throughout this book. But the characters are very important because the problem of personhood is important to the book, and that's maybe why tragedy is important. But when I was thinking about the form that it ended up taking, I did think in the end it has a novel side, but it also has an essay side, and the essay side is in part just because it's sort of knee-jerk Latin American intellectual tradition to go for the essay, but it's kind of like, and it has something to do with the problem of the audience of a book like, one's imagined readers, which in a case like this is very, for me, heterogeneous, and because it's kind of heterogeneous, the essay emerges as important, and I think that's the reason why the essay's been so important in Latin America generally, because the readers and readership tend to be very heterogeneous. Little parenthesis, one of the interesting things to me about this research was the significance of reading, and there's quite a lot in the book about reading and writing, since most of these militants are sort of new readers, not the leaders who are intellectual, but some of the leaders, and a lot of the people are new. In that sense, it's kind of like writing about Protestantism or something like that. That's why I brought in Max Weber too. There's a huge amount of energy around reading and writing and reading out loud that's happening, and writing, an openness to writing, which I think is very inspiring. Some of the writing that happens, they really don't care very much about orthography. They don't care about. They just care about communicating, and there's something about that is very energizing, I think. To read, one of the people who Brian mentioned, Blas Lara, who I started the book with, is a character, not a big character, but a character in the book, who was from Berkeley. I recently got, 2 weeks ago, a letter from a granddaughter of his who teaches Chicano studies in LA or something, who's been reading the book, and his memoir, which he published a memoir late in his life, maybe in the early 50s, is this really wonderfully written book, and at the same time, which he published himself, full of orthographic mistakes. You can see that he's the first generation, and he says he taught himself in the process. So the question of reading and writing in a kind of is important to the characters, and did free me up a little bit in terms of genre, because I found that very instructive, how they, all of them, including the big ones, were very inconsistent in their genre choices, because they're writing in such in such mobile and conditions, in such fragile conditions. So I found that inspiring, and that's part of the essay form. The essay, I think, frames the book in the sense that both the foreword and the introduction are essays, and then starting in chapter 1 to the very end, it takes on the form of a novel. But within that, there are moments in which I, again, write little, because the chapters have short little pieces in them. Some of them, again, take on a slightly essay form. It's a history in the sense that it's all historical research, but...
I wanted to just quickly add something that you said at the beginning of your answer about this tragic tone and whether it's inevitable in the histories of revolution. It seems to me that it's also partly about memory and about self-fashioning after revolutions. And you have this great moment in the book where Ricardo's corpse is returning to Mexico, and I think it's someone in Congress, I can't quite remember, says, all of us who are enduring the humiliation of feasting at the banquet of the revolution should bow our heads to this man. And there's something about there's something unseemly about not inhabiting a tragic reality in the aftermath of revolution that sort of diminishes them somehow. So I think that's another reason why you see this tragic tone as almost inevitable when you're writing about revolution.
And the problem of martyrdom, is very interesting, because when I sent the book to the press, I had the benefit of a very, very punctilious editor, copy editor, who was great, and he really got on my nerves, and it's very, very important. And so whenever I put martyrdom, he'd say, you have to, if a martyr has to be someone killed, right? Which it does, but that's not how they used it. For them, anyone who was deprived of liberty was a martyr. So anyone who was thrown in jail, anyone like that was a martyr, even though they were alive. So that too
expands the circle of suffering. And ma'am.
Sylvia Ledesma, Visual Studies. Do you think Flores Magón has influenced contemporary Mexico's social movement?
Yeah, I mean, he's been always there. I mean, when I was a student, I read Flores Magón, people read him still. And right now, there's, I think, more of that because there's more traction to anarchism than there was, say, when I was a student. So that's one thing. The other thing is, so the short answer is yes, and I think that the influence maybe has been growing, even though I also think that the quality of thinking about what he was writing about and what it meant has been very plastic, and people have used it lots of ways, including ways that may or may not make a lot of sense. So, but he's there, he's continued to be there, and it's very interesting. And I think that there's still more work to do in the sense of other writers who are very important in this group and who have been more forgotten, but there could be a lot more kind of re-editing. I expect there will be. There have been in Mexico, Jacinto Barrera Basolces organizes Ricardo Flores Magón archives, which are a lot of it which is online, and has published annotated versions of this. So a lot of it is available now in quite high quality edition. Then Diego Flores Magón, who's the great grandson of Enrique, one of the brothers, is now setting up the archive of his grandfather, which I had the benefit of being able to work in, but is now, soon is all going to be online. So there's a lot more material that is now available, will be available. So.
I'm sorry. Did you have a follow-up question? No. Okay. Go ahead.
Pablo Gonzalez, Chicano Studies. You know, you mentioned exile, and I think you mentioned in the context of how Chicano scholars have looked at Flores Magón versus Mexicanists and Mexican scholars, I think. And I guess, is that relationship one that you still see in Flores Magón and a lot of the PLM in the United States as exiles, in a sense, in maybe the same kind of way that Chicanos view themselves as ni de aquí ni de allá? Or is it more this attempt that we now see in Chicano studies to try to say de aquí y de allá because of the transnationalism and the kind of sin frontera, which was part of the generación as well, the use of sin fronteras, to try to almost speak to the absence of the history of not only the Magonistas but other Mexican or descent peoples in the United States that can be included in Mexican history as well.
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, first of all, the Chicano movement and some of the main kind of Chicano academics and scholars had a really important role in rethinking and reviving some of this movement's literature in the 70s. It wasn't ever dead in Mexico. There was always, there were editions that were there and that were being read. But the interrogation through the Chicano thing, I think, has been important, even though I think that there's always been, maybe now less, but for a long time in Mexico there was some tension around that particular reading. So for example, Eduardo Blanquer, who was a significant historian of this in Mexico, who died young and everything, but he was very resistant to a kind of Chicano reading of this. I think that both on the Chicano side and Mexican-American side and on the Mexican side, there's been more, in more recent generations, openness of the kind that you're saying. That is, but there still seems to be a lot of work to do, more perhaps even in Mexico than here. But I think there's a fair amount maybe to do here too, insofar as trying to patriate them as Chicanos is also a problem. That is, that's not what they were. That's not what, you know. It's anachronistic. There's something else I wanted to say about what you said.
Because even Juan Gómez Quiñones is in Chicano studies, but he was a Mexicanist first, or Mexican writing about Chicano studies.
Yeah.
So even then, the scope of his dissertation being on the PLM and Ricardo Flores Magón is oftentimes not necessarily still viewed in the context of what it meant to be an exile and the identity formation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans.
One of the movements that happened at a certain point in the scholarship on this was that when they started looking at the circulation of the Generación after the outbreak of the revolution, and they started finding that most of the subscribers were in the United States, in Texas, Arizona, a little bit in California. There was an attempt by some scholars, not necessarily Chicano, but at least Americans who were close to the Chicano stuff, to look at them as already sort of Mexican Americans. I think that's wrong, but it's not entirely wrong. That is definitely true that what's happening on the U.S. side is key to understanding this whole thing, and that's been an irritant for the scholarship also in Mexico. I mentioned the case of Blanquet, because he was distinguished, and he was definitely very resistant to this idea, and he was kind of, while he lived, one of the key people on the scholarship on the Mexican side. So there's been hardship on the Mexican side to forego the process of repatriation that they did with Ricardo as a corpse, and to see that in fact there was a life here. The insistence that these people were precursors of the revolution, when they lived through the whole revolution, they were active through the whole revolution, is one of the interesting things. And that denial of their activity during the Mexican Revolution, that is, in part has to do with this problem. That is, that we have to look then at the commune in which they lived when they were in LA, and what their experiences were in prison in LA, or in Washington State, or in Kansas. And that puts you in an American world that is a little bit bizarre from the point of view of the way in which the Mexican Revolution was classically told, which was as a national revolution.
Yeah.
I'm Sarah Solomon from History. I just have a question, which would probably be a different kind of question. I read your books, so forgive the lack of specificity, but I'm just interested in the way that the contribution you were talking about, the ideological coherence, kind of unfolds through, and this is where I think you're the later part of the book. I don't know where your story ends exactly. But I'm particularly interested in how that unfolds in terms of the kind of coming into power after the revolution. In particular, because it seems to me that is a period of so much sort of heterogeneity and chaos, and that in particular the more radical sort of impacts of these ideologies ended up being so distant from anarchism. In fact, it ended up being sort of the ways and means that the state grew the most in the revolutionary period. So I just wonder how that kind of, that contribution of coherence and kind of more ideological development kind of played out in whatever capacity.
One of the things maybe that gets also to the first comment by from the Emma Goldman papers. From the very beginning, this is not a very coherent set of readings. If you think about coherence in terms of trying to define an ideology and think that the diet of their readings and the diet of their thinking was confined to that ideology, they first read these people like Kropotkin and the like in the library of Camilo Arriaga, who was the son of a rich guy in San Luis Potosí, and that's where they read Marx too, but they also read a lot of positivism. They also, I mean, what they're reading is a hodgepodge of stuff, and nobody was telling them that they shouldn't, and they didn't feel that they shouldn't either. And I don't think that they were very much concerned with coherence in that sense of, this is the doctrine and the only thing we're going to be reading. And since the book ends with the repatriation of Ricardo's body, so that's 1922. And then there's a kind of afterward that goes, has little snippets of things that happen afterward into the 1950s. I don't think that when I'm talking about ideological coherence, I don't think that what I mean exactly is the sense of patrolling an ideological body, but rather simply, let's say, concerted ideological effort, explicit efforts at creating explicit programs and trying to judge what's happening around those programs. And this you have among them, right? They have the production of a program in 1906, they have another production of a program. They have constant newspaper, let's say, shepherding of what it is that's happening and judging what it is that's happening according to their ideas and ideals and the like. But in terms of ideological influences, you're going to find lots of ideological influences in the Mexican Revolution in the 20s and 30s, including a fair amount of anarchism, actually. I think that there's, you know, in Mexico, there's actually quite a lot of anarchist influence, not only in terms of, let's say, anarcho-syndicalism and in the early union movement, but also I think in a lot of the Iberian stuff, you know, sort of various forms of communitarianism. It wasn't maybe very coherent in the sense that much of that agrarian reform did connect, as you point out, just like the union movement connected to the formation of the post-revolutionary state. But it connected to it in a kind of tension that I think is relevant tension because the anarchist side is part of that tension.